A millionaire asked his assistant to have a child with him. When the baby was born and he saw it, he couldn't believe what he discovered. John Callahan gazed over the city from his luxurious office as the sun began to set behind the skyscrapers. The view was stunning, but his mind was far from enjoying it. On his desk, the will of his late father lay like a constant reminder of the burden he bore. He had read it so many times that he could recite it by heart. Control of the Callahan empire will be granted to the first direct heir. If none of my children leaves a legitimate descendant, the inheritance will be divided among the shareholders. He closed the document with a frustrated sigh. He had dedicated his life to building that empire, ensuring that every decision was flawless. But all that effort would be in vain if he didn't leave an heir. To his father, family was not just a sentimental notion, it was the axis of power. Now that same expectation consumed him. John had tried to find love, but his relationships always ended in failure. Women distanced themselves upon discovering the coldness with which he managed his life, his obsession with control, and his inability to disconnect from work. Now, at 40, he found himself alone and trapped in a race against time. As the city lights flickered in the distance, John recalled his sister Claudia's words. She had made it clear that she would seize any opportunity to take control of the empire from him. Claudia had always lived in her brother's shadow and saw the inheritance as her path to recognition. The rivalry between them had intensified since their father's death, and John knew she would stop at nothing to take it all. Time was his greatest enemy, and every day without a child brought him closer to failure. He needed a plan. The next morning, Emily Turner entered his office with a folder under her arm. She had worked for John for years, demonstrating unwavering efficiency and absolute loyalty. Always impeccably dressed, her calm demeanor contrasted with the frantic pace of the office. She placed the documents on the desk without asking questions, as usual. "Here are the financial reports you requested, Mr. Callahan," she said in a serene voice. John nodded, not taking his eyes off the window. Emily was the only person in his life who had never let him down. They were not friends, and there wasn't much closeness between them outside of work. But he had found something more valuable than friendship in her: trust. What John didn't know was that, behind her calm exterior, Emily was living a personal tragedy that she struggled to hide. That night, Emily returned to her small apartment. Michael, her husband, lay on the couch with pale skin and dull eyes, consumed by the illness that was ravaging him. Emily knelt beside him and gently stroked his forehead. "How are you feeling today?" she whispered. Michael managed a faint smile. "You don't have to keep doing this, Em. We know we can't afford more treatments." Emily bit her lip, feeling the anguish welling up in her chest. The medical bills were piling up, and resources were dwindling. She knew time was running out, and each day without a solution felt like a sentence. "Everything will be all right," she murmured, though even she didn't believe her words. She stayed by his side until he fell asleep, watching him struggle to breathe. Desperation seeped into every corner of her life, and the need to find an urgent solution consumed her. Meanwhile, in his office, John grappled with the pressure of his legacy and the need to act swiftly. He had considered several options, but all felt inadequate, until an unexpected idea formed in his mind. Emily. The logic was clear. She was already part of his circle of trust, knew his lifestyle, and above all, was someone he could rely on completely. There would be no need for drama or emotional complications. It would be a practical arrangement, just like any other in his life. For the first time in a long while, John felt he had control. The proposal he was about to make to Emily could be the perfect solution to his problem. Emily was reclining on the sofa when her phone buzzed. It was a call from John. Upon answering, she heard his deep, straightforward voice on the other end of the line. "Emily, I need to see you tomorrow morning in my office. There's something important we need to discuss." She felt her heart race. She had worked for John for years, but something in his tone made her uneasy. What could be so urgent? She hung up with a mix of anxiety and curiosity. She knew that whatever John had to say wouldn't be a trivial conversation. The day that would change their lives was about to begin, and neither of them could imagine the consequences this decision would bring. Emily closed her eyes that night, unaware that the proposal she would receive the next day would not only challenge her principles, but change the course of her life forever. Early the next morning, Emily arrived punctually at John's office. The air in the office felt heavier than usual, and the expression on her boss's face was more serious than she had ever seen. John stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, motionless. "Sit down, Emily," he instructed, not taking his eyes off the horizon. She complied, feeling a slight discomfort. She knew something significant was about to happen, but had no idea what it entailed. John turned slowly to face her, his eyes cold and calculating, but there was a hint of vulnerability in his expression, almost imperceptible. He paused for a moment before speaking, as if the words he was about to utter required surgical precision. "I'll be direct, Emily. I need you to have a child for me." The silence that followed was almost palpable. Emily looked at him, believing she must have misunderstood. Her mind struggled to process the phrase, but it all felt like a cruel joke. "Excuse me?" she finally whispered, hoping John would clarify. "I know this is an unusual proposal, but I need an heir. I don't have time for complicated relationships, and you're the only person I trust enough to carry this out in a controlled and discreet manner." Emily felt the air leave her lungs. The seriousness with which John spoke made it impossible to think he was joking. John took a seat across from her, and in his characteristic calm tone, explained his reasoning. It would be a professional arrangement, a contract, no emotional implications, no personal expectations. Insemination would be the cleanest method to avoid complications, and you would receive financial compensation that would solve any financial problems you might have. Emily felt a lump in her throat. The mention of money hit her like a direct blow to the heart. She couldn't help but think of Michael and the medical bills piling up in her kitchen. "John," she tried to say something, but her voice barely came out. "I don't expect an immediate answer," he continued, as if not noticing her confusion. "I just want you to consider it. I know this may sound cold, but we both know it's the most efficient option for us." Emily looked at him with a mix of disbelief and confusion. The man sitting across from her spoke with the same chill he used to close million-dollar deals, as if human life could be treated with the same detachment. After the meeting, Emily walked out of the office feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had vanished. She headed to the nearest bathroom, shut the door, and pressed her forehead against the cold mirror. Her mind was racing. John's offer was absurd and cruel, but it also represented the only chance she had to save Michael. The moral dilemma suffocated her. Could she bring a child into the world under such a hollow agreement, devoid of love and humanity? And what would happen to her marriage if Michael found out the truth? She stayed in the bathroom for several minutes, breathing deeply, trying to regain control over her emotions. But the truth was undeniable. Each day that passed brought Michael closer to the end, and the options to save him dwindled to nothing. That night, while preparing dinner in her small apartment, Emily tried to hide her worry from Michael, who, though visibly weak, still tried to smile for her. "Are you okay?" he asked, looking at her with tired but attentive eyes. "Yes, it's just been a long day," Emily replied, forcing a smile. She knew she couldn't tell him the truth, not yet. The thought of accepting John's proposal was an unbearable weight, but rejecting it would mean condemning Michael to a quicker death. As they ate in silence, Emily felt desperation growing within her. She needed to make a decision, and she knew she wouldn't have much time to do it. That night, lying next to Michael, Emily couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling as her thoughts swirled endlessly. She knew that accepting would mean sacrificing a part of herself, but it also meant giving the person she loved a chance at life. She turned to Michael, observing his face in the dim light, wondering how much longer she would have with him. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks. There was no easy choice, and whatever path she took would bring her pain. Finally, she closed her eyes, knowing that the next day she would have to give John an answer that would change the course of her life forever. Emily woke with the first light of dawn. She knew what she had to do, even though every fiber of her being wished she weren't in this situation. As she prepared to head to the office, her phone buzzed with a message from John. "Have you made a decision?" Emily read it with her heart racing. She knew that crossing the threshold of the office would mean her life would never be the same again. When she arrived at John's office that morning, Emily felt that each step brought her closer to an abyss. The words of the proposal still echoed in her mind, laden with an almost inhuman coldness. The office door was slightly ajar, and as she stepped inside, she found John sitting behind his enormous desk, as if he already knew what her answer would be. She sat down in front of him, her hands intertwined to hide the slight tremor in her fingers. John watched her with the same unflappable calm as always, waiting for her to speak first. "I've made a decision," Emily said, taking a deep breath. "I accept." John nodded slightly, a hint of approval in his demeanor, as if everything was unfolding exactly as he had anticipated. He opened a black folder and pulled out a contract detailing every aspect of the agreement, the conditions of the pregnancy, the financial compensation, and the confidentiality clauses. "Everything we discussed is here. You can read it carefully before signing," John said, pushing the folder toward her. Emily glanced at the document for a few seconds before taking the pen. There was no time for doubts. Michael's life depended on this signature. With a firm stroke, she signed her name at the bottom of each page, feeling a huge weight lift off her shoulders. John reviewed the practical details with her. The insemination would take place at a private clinic, and during the pregnancy, she would receive top-tier medical care. The financial compensation would cover not only Michael's treatments, but also any other needs that might arise. "I want you to understand something, Emily," John said as he closed the folder. "I don't expect to interfere in your personal life, nor do I expect you to interfere in mine. This is strictly a professional agreement." Emily nodded slowly, though inside she felt that the line between personal and professional was dangerously blurring. That night, back in her apartment, Emily faced the first of many lies. Michael looked at her from the couch with that weary smile that always broke her heart. "How was work today?" he asked as she helped him get comfortable. "It was intense, as always," Emily replied, avoiding his gaze. Every word that left her mouth made her feel guiltier, but she knew she couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. Michael was already dealing with enough due to his illness. He didn't need to know the sacrifices she was making for him. The following days flew by quickly. John and Emily attended the first appointment at the clinic, where the procedure was performed without complications. Although everything had started off professionally, John exhibited a slight change in behavior. It wasn't just efficiency that kept him present. He seemed genuinely interested in ensuring everything went well. "How are you feeling?" he asked during the first medical checkup. Emily looked at him, surprised. It was the first time John had asked her such a personal question. "Fine, I guess," she replied, trying to sound neutral. That small gesture was the first indication that the agreement was beginning to evolve into something more complex than either of them had anticipated. As the weeks went by, Emily started to feel the emotional weight of her decision. Every time she looked at Michael, the guilt intensified. She knew she was doing everything for him, but that justification was no longer enough to calm her conscience. At the same time, John seemed less distant. The coldness with which he had approached the agreement began to give way to small moments of empathy. Their conversations became longer, and although both tried to maintain professional distance, the connection was inevitable. One day, after a checkup, John walked her to her car. Before Emily got in, he did something unexpected. He placed a hand on her shoulder and said softly, "Thank you for doing this." That gesture, simple yet sincere, shook Emily's defenses. For a moment, she felt that the man standing before her was not just an unyielding tycoon, but someone who, like her, bore a burden that few would understand. Emily returned home that night, feeling her life crumbling slowly. She knew the path she had taken was dangerous, not only for her marriage, but also for her heart. The deal that had seemed so clear at first was starting to complicate in ways neither of them had foreseen. That night, while Michael slept, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer she could keep both lives separate. And somewhere inside her, an unsettling question began to arise. What if this isn't just an agreement? What if I'm starting to feel something more for John? As the weeks passed, morning sickness and the first signs of pregnancy began to appear. Emily couldn't help but feel an unexpected connection to the baby growing inside her. Though she tried not to think too much about what it meant, her body reminded her at every moment that she carried a new life within. John, for his part, also began to change, albeit more subtly. At first, he had assumed that after the agreement, he could remain emotionally distant. However, as he accompanied Emily to the medical appointments, something within him began to soften. Each heartbeat of the baby, each ultrasound, slowly melted away his defenses. One day, while they were waiting in the clinic's waiting room, Emily noticed John watching her in silence. His eyes no longer displayed the same coldness they had at the beginning. There was a glimmer of curiosity in them, or perhaps something deeper that he didn't yet understand. "What?" Emily asked, realizing he was staring. John shook his head slightly. "Nothing. I was just thinking about how incredible all of this is." Emily felt a slight shiver. That was the first time John showed a glimpse of real emotion, a window into the man behind the tycoon. Days later, John surprised Emily by announcing that he wanted to be more involved in the preparations for the baby's arrival. He took her to a baby furniture store, something she hadn't expected. She thought he would simply delegate those tasks to someone else. But John seemed determined to be present for every detail. As they walked among cribs and toys, Emily watched him with growing surprise. The man who once seemed so calculating was now holding a mobile for the crib, with a concentrated expression, evaluating whether it would be suitable for the baby's room. "I never imagined you would be interested in these things," Emily said, trying to sound casual. John gave a half smile. "It's my first time doing something like this. I want to get it right." That simple comment resonated deeply with Emily. Perhaps, beneath his cold exterior, John longed for more than he himself recognized. Meanwhile, Emily's relationship with Michael began to show deeper cracks. The clinic visits, the meetings with John, and the secrets she kept were slowly eroding their marriage. Michael sensed the distance between them, even if he didn't fully understand what was happening. "I notice you're different, Em," he said one night while she helped him get settled. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Emily quickly shook her head, avoiding his gaze. "It's just work. It's been a lot lately." Michael sighed, though he didn't seem convinced. The sadness in his eyes felt like a stab to Emily's heart, but she knew she couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. The time she had left with Michael was limited, and she didn't want to ruin what little they had left together. One afternoon, after a routine checkup, John invited Emily for coffee at a nearby cafe. Although she hesitated at first, she eventually accepted. It felt strange, almost surreal, to be sitting with him in such an informal setting. "Did you ever imagine your life would take this turn?" John asked as he stirred his coffee. Emily let out a brief, bitter laugh. "Definitely not. But I guess no one can plan everything." John looked at her intently, as if those words resonated with something inside him. "What about you?" Emily asked, suddenly curious. "Did you ever think about becoming a father before all this?" John fell silent for a moment, fiddling with his spoon. "No, I always thought I didn't have time for that. But now, I don't know. Something has changed." That moment of honesty surprised them both. For the first time, John admitted that he was beginning to see the pregnancy as something more than a mere transaction. And Emily felt, much to her dismay, a connection with him that she had never imagined possible. The next day, John did something unexpected. Without telling Emily, he arranged for a specialist to do a private checkup on Michael at their apartment. The gesture took Emily by surprise and deeply moved her. She knew John had no obligation to do it, yet he had. When Michael asked how she managed to get such an expensive doctor to visit, Emily simply replied, "A friend wanted to help." Michael smiled weakly, grateful. But inside, Emily felt the lines between her professional and personal life beginning to blur even more. That night, as Emily rested beside Michael, she felt for the first time that her world was splitting into two. On one side, her life with the man she had loved for years, and on the other, the growing connection with the man who had changed the course of her destiny. She lay staring at the ceiling, knowing that things wouldn't be any easier from now on. The emotions she had tried to suppress were starting to surface, and with each passing day, her relationship with John became more complicated. Emily closed her eyes, aware that she was trapped in an emotional maze from which she might never escape. As the relationship between John and Emily slowly evolved, Claudia Stevens watched her brother from the shadows. She had always felt that her father's favoritism toward John had robbed her of the opportunities she deserved. Ambition consumed her, and the possibility of John solidifying his control with an heir was unacceptable. For weeks, she had begun to notice small changes in her brother's routine. His trusted assistant, Emily, was now spending more time with him outside of working hours. That unusual closeness sparked Claudia's suspicion that something significant was happening. Determined to uncover the truth, Claudia decided to set her own plan in motion. She knew that if she could discredit John before the baby was born, she would have a real chance to take control of the Callahan empire. In her search for allies, Claudia approached Ethan Collins, an ambitious young man eager to climb the corporate ladder quickly. Ethan had been observing from the periphery for some time, waiting for an opportunity to stand out. The promise of power and wealth that Claudia offered was enough to convince him to join her. "I need you to keep your eyes peeled," Claudia said during their first secret meeting. "I want to know every move John makes, every meeting he has with Emily. Something is happening, and we're going to find out what it is." Ethan agreed without hesitation. He knew helping Claudia was a risk, but it was also his chance to gain access to the most exclusive circles of power. Ethan began to closely monitor John and Emily's movements. He kept tabs on the files passing through Emily's hands, searching for any clues that would confirm his suspicions. Soon he noticed that many of the meetings between John and Emily didn't appear on the official company schedules. Moreover, the visits to private clinics and medical consultations didn't go unnoticed. Ethan began to gather every detail, knowing that information was power. Claudia instructed him to act with caution. She wanted enough evidence before delivering the final blow. Claudia knew that mere suspicion wouldn't be enough to destroy her brother. She needed concrete proof that could trigger a scandal. Through her contacts in the press, she began to subtly spread rumors about John and his alleged secret relationship with his assistant. The rumors seeped into high society circles, where every malicious comment could become a weapon. John's reputation began to waver, and he noticed. Though he didn't show it, he felt the walls closing in around him. Daniel Foster, John's trusted lawyer and friend, sensed the first signs of the storm brewing. He knew Claudia well enough to recognize that she wouldn't stop at anything to destroy her brother. In a private meeting, he decided to warn John. "Something's not right, John. I've heard things. Claudia is making moves, and I wouldn't be surprised if she's behind those rumors." John, though he had always distrusted his sister, felt this time that the danger was real. He couldn't afford to let a scandal affect the company, especially now that he was expecting his heir. "I'll handle it," he replied coldly. However, deep down, he knew that the real danger was closer than he imagined. Claudia was relentless, and this time she wasn't going to give up without a fight. As Claudia and Ethan fine-tuned their plan to destroy John, the relationship between John and Emily continued to strengthen. However, they were both unaware that they were being watched. Claudia's shadow loomed over them, and the clock was ticking. In the coming days, tensions would rise, and the truth they had tried so hard to conceal could come to light in the most devastating way. Days passed quickly, and Emily began to feel as though she was living two completely opposite lives. In one, she was the devoted wife caring for Michael, who continued to fight his illness. In the other, she was growing closer to John, the man who had transformed her life in ways she never could have imagined. The medical appointments, the preparations for the baby, and unexpectedly sincere conversations with John became a routine that slowly enveloped her. Each time she returned home, she felt the guilt digging deeper into her heart. Michael didn't deserve the lies she was telling him, but Emily couldn't find a way to stop what had begun. Michael sensed the change. Every time Emily arrived late, every time she avoided his questions, the distance between them grew. "Emily, I know something is going on," he said one night, his voice barely audible. She avoided his gaze and murmured, "I'm just tired, Michael. This has been too much." But both knew that the truth was more complicated than a simple excuse. As the situation with Michael deteriorated, the relationship between Emily and John continued to deepen. Although both tried to keep things professional, the boundaries were becoming increasingly blurred. During one of the medical appointments, John insisted on driving Emily home afterward. During the ride, their conversation flowed beyond pregnancy-related matters. "I never thought this would be so complicated," Emily admitted, gazing out the car window. John, surprisingly sincere, replied, "Neither did I." That moment of vulnerability brought them closer than they would have liked to admit. Something about the way they understood each other, without the need for words, connected them in an unexpected way. The tension in Emily's marriage reached a critical point one night when Michael, exhausted by uncertainty and pain, decided to confront her. "Emily, please, tell me the truth. Is there something you're not telling me?" She remained still, unable to look him in the eye. She knew she had reached the limit of her lies, but she also knew that revealing the truth could shatter him completely. "Michael, I don't want to lose you," she whispered, feeling tears threatening to escape. "Then don't lie to me," he replied, his voice broken. "Whatever it is, I want to know." Emily felt her heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. She couldn't tell him the truth, not now, not when every day with him could be the last. After that confrontation, Emily began to question every decision she had made. The agreement that had initially seemed like a logical solution now felt like an emotional burden that threatened to destroy everything she loved. John was also starting to notice the emotional impact that the pregnancy was having on both of them. Although he tried to maintain his composure, he found himself becoming more involved in Emily's life and more excited about the arrival of the baby. Unknowingly, he was beginning to see in her and the child a possibility of having the family he had never imagined. Meanwhile, Claudia and Ethan continued their investigation from the shadows. Ethan had gathered enough information to confirm that something deeper was happening between John and Emily. The pregnancy and the frequent medical visits were not mere coincidences. "It's just a matter of time before we have what we need," Ethan told Claudia. She smiled coldly. She knew that each passing day brought her brother closer to ruin. Soon, she would have the evidence needed to expose him publicly. That night, while Emily tried to sleep, she felt the weight of her decisions becoming unbearable. She knew she was on the brink of losing everything she loved: Michael, her integrity, and the little stability she had left. And while John seemed closer every day, that closeness also terrified her. At the same time, in another corner of the city, Claudia and Ethan were finalizing the details of their plan to expose the truth. A storm was brewing, and when it erupted, nothing would ever be the same. The day of the first ultrasound arrived, filled with expectations. Emily and John found themselves in the clinic room, surrounded by the dim light of the screen that would project the baby's image for the first time. Emily tried to control her emotions, while John remained silent, hands folded in his lap. The sound of the heartbeat resonated in the room like a soft yet powerful drumbeat. Emily felt her eyes fill with tears upon hearing that sound for the first time. Unintentionally, she turned to John, who also seemed affected. John, a man who rarely showed any emotion, pressed his lips together slightly. There was something about that heartbeat that shook him in a way he hadn't expected. For a moment, he ceased to be the calculating mogul and allowed himself to feel. That heartbeat represented more than the continuation of his legacy. It was the promise of a future he had never thought possible. "It's incredible," he murmured, almost to himself. Emily looked at him in surprise. That small moment was enough to make her realize that things between them were changing. The agreement they had sealed with coldness was beginning to acquire a more human nuance. After the ultrasound, John began to show more involvement in the process. Although he tried to keep a professional distance, something within him seemed to have shifted. Unexpectedly, he started to care about Emily beyond what was necessary. During one of the checkups, he brought her flowers, saying it was a silly gesture, but it felt right. Emily couldn't help but smile. These small gestures only confused her further. She knew she shouldn't get excited, but it was hard to ignore the transformation occurring in John. "I didn't know you had this side to you," Emily remarked lightly, as they shared a coffee after the medical appointment. John raised an eyebrow, not taking his gaze off the coffee between his hands. "Maybe I didn't know either." Emily felt a knot in her stomach. She knew they were crossing an invisible line, but she couldn't help but feel closer to him with each passing day. At home, Michael increasingly sensed the distance between him and Emily. Though she tried to be present, the connection between them weakened over time. Emily's absences became more frequent, and her excuses more vague. "Are you sure everything is okay?" Michael asked one night, his voice weakened by illness but filled with concern. Emily remained silent for a few seconds, unable to look him in the eye. "Yes, of course. It's just work." Michael nodded slowly, but his expression revealed that he didn't believe his wife's words. He knew something had changed, but he didn't have the strength to confront it. During an unexpectedly close conversation, John and Emily discussed the possibility of choosing a name for the baby. It was a simple topic, but filled with meaning. "Have you thought of any names?" John asked as they flipped through a catalogue of cribs and decorations for the baby's room together. "I'm not sure," Emily replied, a shy smile appearing. "Do you have any suggestions?" John paused for a moment, reflecting. Then, with a nostalgic expression, he said, "My mother always wanted me to have a son named William." Emily felt a chill at those words. She had never heard John speak of his mother. It was as if, little by little, the barriers between them began to crumble, and that terrified her. As Emily and John inadvertently built a deeper bond, Claudia and Ethan continued to work in the shadows. The two had gathered enough information to confirm that Emily's pregnancy was part of an arrangement with John. Claudia knew that the news could trigger a devastating scandal if it leaked at the right moment. "When the baby is born, it will be too late to stop it. We need to act before that," Claudia said with a cold smile. Ethan nodded. He knew that John's downfall was a matter of time, and when that happened, he too would have his opportunity to rise. That night, as Emily prepared for bed, she felt her emotions overwhelming her. She was caught between two worlds, her life with Michael, which was slowly crumbling, and the growing connection with John, which became stronger with each passing day. She lay down next to Michael, but her mind was elsewhere. Somewhere deep in her heart, the inevitable question began to form. What if she was starting to fall in love with John? Meanwhile, in another corner of the city, Claudia and Ethan were finalizing the details of their plan. The truth was about to come to light, and when that happened, Nothing would ever be the same. Claudia's plan was almost ready to execute. In her luxurious office, alongside Ethan Collins, they reviewed every detail with precision. They had gathered enough information to suggest to the public that Emily's baby was not the result of a genuine relationship, but rather a secret arrangement between John and his assistant. "It's simple," Claudia said, pouring 2 glasses of wine. "If we leak the story before the baby is born, John's reputation will be completely destroyed." Ethan smiled conspiratorially. John Callahan's downfall was the perfect opportunity for him to rise in the corporate hierarchy. Claudia, on her part, had a more ambitious goal: to destroy her brother and take control of the Callahan empire once and for all. While Claudia and Ethan finalized their attack, Emily remained trapped in the contradictory emotions surrounding her. Guilt and remorse for hiding the truth from Michael consumed her, and the tensions in her marriage had become unbearable. "Emily, you're not the same anymore," Michael said one night, his voice dulled by weakness. "If there's something you're not telling me, I need to know." Emily felt tears welling up, but she held back. She knew that telling him the truth would only hurt him more, but keeping the secret felt like carrying a weight that crushed her a little more each day. "I'm doing the best I can," she whispered, unable to provide a real explanation. The silence between them became unbearable, and the distance that grew between them threatened to break what little remained of their relationship. On the other hand, John was beginning to experience a profound change. The pregnancy not only gave him a new perspective on life, but also brought him closer to Emily emotionally, in a way he hadn't expected. One day, after another medical checkup, John accompanied her for a walk in a nearby park. They walked in silence, feeling that words were unnecessary. At one point, they stopped by a lake, watching as the sun began to set. "I never thought this would make me feel so human," John confessed, his gaze lost on the horizon. Emily looked at him, surprised by the honesty in his words. "You're not so different from the rest, John," she said softly. That moment was a turning point for both of them. Without saying it aloud, they knew that the bond between them had grown stronger than they had planned. As John and Emily grew closer, Claudia decided it was the perfect moment to launch the first strike. Using contacts in the tabloid press, she circulated a rumor suggesting that John was involved in a scandalous agreement with his assistant to have a child. The headline appeared in several tabloids the next day: "Tycoon John Callahan and his scandalous deal, a baby by contract?" The news spread rapidly, generating rumors on social media and provoking a media frenzy. John learned of the scandal from one of his business partners, who called him, worried about the impact on the company. "Is it true, John?" his partner asked in a grave voice. "Is what they're saying true?" John gritted his teeth. He knew this was Claudia's doing, but for now, he had no proof to accuse her. When Emily saw the headlines, she felt her world collapsing around her. She knew this was just the beginning of something much larger. If Claudia had discovered part of the agreement, it wouldn't be long before she found the rest. "John, this is just the beginning," Emily said, her voice trembling when she called him to discuss the situation. John, for his part, was trying to stay calm, but deep down, he knew things were about to spiral out of control. "Don't worry, I'll handle this," he replied, though he wasn't sure how. He knew he had to act quickly to contain the damage, but he also understood that the coming days would be critical. Claudia wouldn't stop until she had completely destroyed him. That night, as Emily tried to fall asleep, she felt the impending storm was inevitable. She knew her life was on the brink of an abyss, and soon she would have to make decisions that could change everything. Across the city, Claudia celebrated the success of her first attack. She knew the scandal was just the beginning, and with a little more pressure, she could destroy her brother forever. Meanwhile, John, sitting alone in his office, stared at the ultrasound photo of the baby he had kept on his desk. He knew his life was about to change forever, but he was determined to protect what was beginning to give him meaning: the baby he was expecting with Emily. Michael had lost weight rapidly, and his skin was as pale as marble. Every time Emily looked at him, she felt her husband fading before her eyes. The illness was advancing unchecked, and the treatments, though costly, only managed to delay the inevitable. Michael was on the brink of his physical and emotional limits, and his condition placed an ever-increasing pressure on Emily. She tried to be present at all times, but her heart was divided between the man she had loved for years and the child she carried in her womb, the result of an agreement that was becoming more complicated than she had ever imagined. One afternoon, as she helped him move to the sofa, Michael looked at her with dull but attentive eyes. We don't have much time, do we?" Emily felt a knot in her throat. She wanted to lie, to tell him that everything would be fine, but they both knew the truth was unavoidable. She could only nod, unable to utter a single word. The days with Michael became a routine of heavy silences and half-hearted conversations. Every time he tried to connect with Emily emotionally, she pulled away more, consumed by guilt and the secrets that suffocated her. "Emily, I want you to be here with me. Not just physically, but truly," he said one night, his voice barely a whisper. Emily turned to him, feeling desperation overwhelm her soul. How could she explain what she had done? How could she tell him that she carried the child of another man to save him? It was a truth too cruel to share. "I'm here, Michael." "I am," she murmured, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Amidst the emotional chaos, Michael suffered a severe relapse one night. Emily jolted awake at the sound of his violent coughing from the other room. She rushed to him and found him struggling to breathe, his face drenched in cold sweat. "Michael, hold on!" she shouted as she dialed emergency services with trembling hands. The minutes felt eternal, and when the paramedics finally arrived, Michael was unconscious. Emily felt the ground beneath her feet crumble as they loaded him into the ambulance. She stood in the doorway of their apartment, watching the red and blue lights fade into the night. That same night, not knowing who else to turn to, Emily called John from the hospital waiting room. She didn't expect him to answer immediately, but he did. "John, Michael is really bad. I don't know what to do." Emily's voice cracked, and tears began to flow uncontrollably. "I'm on my way," John said without hesitation. When John arrived at the hospital, he found Emily collapsed in one of the waiting room chairs. Without saying anything, he sat down next to her and took her hand, offering her the only comfort he could provide. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt someone holding her amidst her pain. Despite the coldness with which everything had begun between them, John had become her strongest support in a moment of absolute vulnerability. When the doctors finally allowed Emily to enter the room, she found Michael awake but extremely weak. He knew his time was running out. With a sad smile, he gestured for her to come closer. "I can't keep fighting, Em. I'm ready to rest," he whispered. Emily felt tears streaming down her face uncontrollably. She knelt beside him, resting her head on his chest, feeling how the love they shared intertwined with the pain of farewell. "I love you, Michael. I always will," she murmured between sobs. Michael gently stroked her hair, and with his last breath said, "Live, Em. Please live." That night, Michael closed his eyes for the last time, leaving Emily with a devastating emptiness in her heart. Sitting next to his lifeless body, she felt the decisions she had made to save him becoming even heavier. The man for whom she had sacrificed everything was gone, and now she had to face an uncertain future, alone with the baby she carried inside. Meanwhile, John waited outside the room, unaware that Michael's death would only mark the beginning of a new phase in their lives. The shadows of the past and the secrets were about to come to light, and the conflict between them and Claudia was just beginning. The sky was grey and the air cold when Emily said goodbye to Michael in an intimate ceremony. Only a few close friends attended the funeral, along with distant family members. Emily stood still beside the coffin, feeling that every farewell word was a reminder of the lies she had maintained until the end. John attended silently, keeping his distance to avoid arousing suspicion. He didn't need to be there, but his presence provided Emily with silent support in the most difficult moment of her life. As the last rose petals fell onto the coffin, she felt she had lost more than just her husband. She had lost a part of herself. After the funeral, John took Emily back to her apartment. He knew she needed company, but he also knew that his feelings for her were beginning to cross a dangerous line. "What will you do now?" John asked softly as they sat on her sofa. Emily shrugged, unable to respond. Everything she had built around Michael had vanished. Now only the baby on the way and the uncertain future with John remained. "I'll be here for whatever you need, Emily," John added, looking at her with a mix of concern and affection. Emily felt her heart tremble. She knew the connection between them was deeper than it should be, but she couldn't help but cling to him. In the midst of her pain, John had become her refuge. As John and Emily tried to navigate their emotions, Claudia was about to deliver the final blow. Now that the scandal of the pregnancy had begun to spread, it was time to expose the full truth. "It's time to reveal the agreement to the world," Claudia told Ethan. Ethan nodded, handing her the documents proving the transaction between John and Emily, the bank transfers and private medical appointments. It was all the ammunition they needed to destroy John. Claudia planned to leak this information to the press at a strategic moment, ensuring that there would be no way to save her brother's reputation. Meanwhile, rumors about the agreement continued to grow, affecting morale within the company and weakening John's position. Partners began to question his leadership, and the press relentlessly pursued him, seeking an official statement. Under the pressure, John began to doubt. Although he had wanted to trust Emily, the rumors and insinuations planted a seed of insecurity. Could she have been hiding something more? He decided to do something he hadn't planned, secretly order a DNA test to ensure the baby was really his. He couldn't afford more mistakes. If there was a betrayal, he needed to uncover it before it was too late. Emily started to notice the growing distance in John's demeanor. Although he remained present, something had changed in his gaze, as if doubt consumed him in silence. "Is everything okay, John?" Emily asked one day, sensing the tension in the air. "Yes, of course. I'm just busy with the company," John replied, avoiding her gaze. Emily knew something was wrong, but she didn't have the strength to confront it. She was emotionally drained, struggling to maintain her balance as the truth began to crumble around her. Days later, John received the results of the DNA test. As he opened the envelope, he felt the ground beneath him disappear. The baby wasn't his. The reality hit him like a punch to the gut. The child he had been so excited about was, in fact, Michael's. John clenched his fists, feeling a mix of anger and betrayal that consumed him entirely. How could he have been so naive? He had let his guard down, had trusted, and now everything was falling apart. Now, sitting in his office, John stared at the ultrasound of the baby with eyes filled with unshed tears. He knew he had to confront Emily, but he also knew that confrontation would change their lives forever. John remained motionless in his office, the DNA test results in hand. Rage and disappointment consumed him, feeling like his whole world had crumbled. After a long silence, he stood up with a cold, fixed gaze. He knew he could no longer postpone the inevitable. Emily had to explain herself. That night, he called Emily and asked her to come to his house. His tone left no room for doubt. This would not be an easy conversation. Emily arrived feeling the weight of tension in the air, and as soon as she stepped through the door, she knew something was terribly wrong. "What's going on, John?" she asked cautiously, already feeling that the truth had come to light. John threw the papers on the table between them. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" he snapped, his voice heavy with suppressed anger. Emily looked at the results, feeling her world collapse. Her greatest fear had come true. John had discovered that the baby wasn't his. I did it for Michael. I couldn't let him die without giving him a chance, she murmured through tears. Emily's explanation only fueled John's fury. He felt used, betrayed by the only person he had truly trusted. "Do you realize what you've done?" he shouted, unable to contain himself. "All of this, the baby, the illusion of forming a family, it was a lie." Emily cried, unable to find the words to defend herself. She knew what she had done was inexcusable, but she also knew she had acted out of desperation to save the man she loved. "I didn't want to hurt you, John. I really didn't." Her voice was a broken whisper. John looked at her with a mix of anger and pain. Part of him wanted to walk away forever, to sever any ties with her and the baby that now represented everything he had lost. But another, deeper, more painful part knew it was already too late. As they argued, the memory of the last conversation between Michael and John surfaced in the mogul's mind. Before he died, Michael had asked him to take care of Emily and the baby, to give them a chance at a future. That plea echoed in his mind, adding another layer of conflict to his emotions. "Michael asked me to take care of you both," John said quietly, almost as if he were talking to himself. Emily looked at him with pained eyes, knowing that promise was the only thing that could keep them together. "I don't expect your forgiveness, John. I know this is more than you can bear. But the baby, he's not to blame for any of this." John clenched his fists, struggling against the whirlwind of emotions that overwhelmed him. He knew Emily was right. Despite the betrayal, the baby was innocent. And even though he wasn't biologically his, he had started to love the child in a way he had never thought possible. The silence between them was heavy and charged with emotions. They both knew they were at a crossroads. John could walk away and leave it all behind, or he could stay and take on a responsibility he had never imagined. After what felt like an eternity, John broke the silence. "I need time. This is much more complicated than I imagined, but I'm not going to leave you alone with this." Emily nodded, grateful for that small gesture of hope. She knew she couldn't ask for more at that moment, but she also knew that decision meant more than words could express. As John and Emily dealt with the truth and tried to find a way forward, Claudia wasted no time. Determined to ruin her brother, she leaked the results of the DNA test to the media. The scandal exploded like a bomb, with headlines branding John a fraud and questioning his ability to lead the company. John learned of the scandal from Daniel Foster, his friend and lawyer, who showed him the sensationalist headlines. "We knew this could happen, but Claudia has gone too far this time." John took a deep breath, feeling rage bubbling inside him. He had endured too many betrayals, but this time he wouldn't allow his sister to win. Standing by his window, John looked out at the city with renewed determination. He knew the next step would define not only the future of the company, but also his personal life. He couldn't let Claudia destroy everything he had built, nor could he abandon Emily and the baby. The news of the scandal flooded the front pages and digital headlines. "Tycoon John Callahan duped. His assistant's baby isn't his." Rumors and speculation flew across social media, and the company's partners began to grow uneasy. The shares of the Callahan empire plummeted rapidly, and investors demanded immediate answers. John found himself at the center of the storm, with the press hounding him and the board questioning his leadership. Yet amid the chaos, his mind was clearer than ever. Claudia had crossed a line, and now it was time to make her pay for every betrayal. "We're not going to lose," he told Daniel Foster, his friend and lawyer. "It's time to play by the same rules as Claudia." John met with Daniel in the office to plan his final move. They knew that to disarm Claudia, they needed to expose her own secrets. For weeks, Daniel had been gathering information on Claudia's shady dealings, her manipulation of the board, and the leaks to the press. "We have enough evidence to take her down," Daniel said, placing a thick file on the table. "But the question is, are you ready to destroy her publicly? This goes beyond a family rivalry." John looked at the file in silence for a few seconds, then nodded. "She left me no choice." As John and Daniel prepared their offensive, Emily also grappled with the consequences of the scandal. The rumors had turned her into the center of unwanted attention, and the malicious comments never ceased. Every time she left her house, she felt the eyes of people on her. John stood by her side, offering silent support, but he knew that his presence couldn't stop the tide of criticism. Emily felt as if she was about to break. "I can't handle this, John," she said one night, tears in her eyes. "I don't know if I can live with all of this." John took her hand firmly. "You're not going to do this alone. I won't let Claudia win." The day of the board meeting arrived, and Claudia entered with the confidence of someone who believed she had won. However, her arrogance quickly faded as John and Daniel presented evidence of her manipulations and illegal dealings. "Here is all the evidence of Claudia's hidden accounts and her strategy to destroy the company," Daniel announced to the board, handing out copies of the documents to each member. Claudia paled, realizing her plan had collapsed. John stepped closer to her and whispered, "You played hard, Claudia, but you underestimated how far I'm willing to go." The board quickly reached a unanimous decision. Claudia was removed from her position, and all her shares in the company were frozen. In one fell swoop, John had regained total control of the empire and neutralized his greatest enemy. With Claudia out of the way, John met Emily privately. Despite the chaos, one thing had become clear to him. His life was no longer the same without her. "I don't know how we got here, but I want you to remain a part of my life, Emily," he said, looking at her with honesty for the first time. Emily, despite all the wounds and pain, felt she had found in John a partner with whom she could face the future. "I don't know what awaits us, but I want to try." John took her hand, and in that moment, they both knew that the future would be uncertain, but they would face it together, as a family. As John and Emily shared that intimate moment, a message arrived on John's phone. It was from Daniel. "We have a problem. Someone else is investigating the agreement," the message read. Just a few hours after the board meeting, John reviewed Daniel's message with his heart racing. The information was clear. Someone else was digging into the agreement between him and Emily, but this time the goal wasn't just to damage his reputation, but to uncover details that even Claudia had overlooked. "There's a journalist investigating the case," Daniel explained over the phone. "He has important contacts and seems determined to bring something bigger to light." John felt a chill run down his spine. He knew the past he had tried to bury was still threatening to surface. This battle was far from over. John knew he had to act quickly to stay ahead of this new threat. He gathered Daniel and the legal team to analyze the situation and decide on the next steps. They couldn't afford mistakes this time. "We need to find out who is behind this and what they're after," John said firmly. "We won't allow them to destroy what we've worked so hard to rebuild." Daniel nodded. The loyalty he felt toward his friend was stronger than ever. "Let me handle this. If someone is going to play dirty, it will be us." Meanwhile, Emily noticed how the tension began to reclaim John. Although he tried to keep her at arm's length to protect her, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She knew something more was happening, but John wasn't telling her the whole truth. "John, what's going on?" she asked one night, sitting beside him on the sofa. John looked at her in silence, debating whether to share his fears. Finally, he decided to be honest. "There's someone else investigating the agreement. We don't know who or what they're after, but I'm not going to let that destroy us." Emily felt her heart constrict. The possibility of the past coming to light filled her with fear. "And what are we going to do?" John took her hand gently. "We'll face it together. This time I won't leave you alone." While Daniel tracked down the journalist, he discovered something unsettling. Behind the investigation was a business partner who had secretly worked with Claudia. This man, Vincent Marshall, had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and Claudia's downfall had given him the opportunity he needed to try and take control. Vincent is looking for more than just to ruin your reputation, John, Daniel warned. He wants your position in the company. John gritted his teeth. He couldn't believe that even with Claudia out of the way, enemies were still emerging, willing to do anything to overthrow him. With Vincent's threat growing closer, John and Emily knew they had to make a difficult decision. They could no longer live under the constant fear that their secrets would be revealed. They had to get ahead of Vincent and control the narrative before he did. "We need to give our side of the story before he does," Emily suggested, surprising John with her determination. "If we're honest, no one will be able to use us against ourselves." John looked at her with admiration. He knew that this decision required courage, but he also knew it was the only way to move forward without fear. "We'll do this together," he said with a faint smile. "This time, we won't let anyone control us." John and Emily knew they had to control the narrative if they wanted to protect their future. The only option was to be transparent and get ahead of any attempt at manipulation by Vincent Marshall. With Daniel and the public relations team, they carefully prepared every word they would say to the press. "It won't be easy," Daniel warned, "but if we show vulnerability and sincerity, we'll have a chance." Emily took a deep breath. This time she would face the consequences without hiding. John looked at her with a mix of pride and gratitude. Together, they had come farther than they ever imagined, and now only one more step remained. The day of the press conference arrived. Reporters filled the room, eager to hear the official version from the protagonists of the scandal that had captured everyone's attention. Cameras focused on the couple as John took the floor. "I know many things have been said about us in recent weeks," John began, his voice steady. "And today, we want to clarify the truth." With a mix of honesty and calm, John and Emily explained how their agreement had come about, detailing the reasons behind each decision. Emily admitted that she had acted out of desperation to save Michael, and John acknowledged that, despite how everything had started, the bond he had developed with the baby and with Emily was deeper than he had ever imagined. "This baby isn't biologically mine, but I love him as if he were," John said, looking at Emily with determination. "And we are here to build a life together, no matter the challenges we have to face." The silence in the room was absolute for a few seconds. Then questions began to arise, but the narrative had shifted. Instead of a scandal, journalists now saw a story of redemption, sacrifice, and unexpected love. Vincent Marshall, who had been watching the live broadcast, felt his plan crumble before his eyes. John's transparency had disarmed the weapon he had planned to use against him. Without the scandal narrative, Vincent was left with no cards to play. "It's not over," Vincent murmured, although he knew his moment of glory was slipping away quickly. After the conference, John and Emily walked out of the building hand in hand, facing the throngs of cameras and flashes together. There were no more secrets, no more lies. Both felt relieved to realize that, although the path had been complicated, they could now move forward without fear of the past. "We did it," Emily said softly, looking at John with a mix of relief and hope. "Yes, we did," he replied, gently squeezing her hand. "And this is just the beginning." Back at home, John and Emily felt a real sense of peace for the first time in a long while. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, they felt ready to face it together. John caressed Emily's belly, feeling the life growing inside her, and smiled. "We're going to be a family," he said, his voice filled with promise. Emily nodded, feeling that they had finally found their way. As John and Emily enjoyed their first moment of calm, John's phone vibrated. It was Daniel. "We need to talk, John. There's something else you should know about Vincent," Daniel said seriously. John met with Daniel the next day, anxious about the grave tone of the message. Daniel welcomed him into his office, holding a folder in his hand. "Vincent won't stop. I have information confirming that he's still looking for a way to bring you down," he said, handing over the documents. Inside the file, John found irregular contracts and shady agreements linked to Vincent. Not only was he trying to take control of the company, but he had also secretly manipulated assets for years, setting the stage to usurp the Callahan fortune. "This is bigger than we imagined," Daniel continued. "If we don't stop him now, he could make you lose everything." John gritted his teeth. The battle was far from over. John knew that to defeat Vincent, he needed to act quickly. He couldn't risk another illicit maneuver leaving his company in ruins. With Daniel, he outlined a detailed plan to expose Vincent's illegal actions to the board and financial authorities. This time, they would leave no loose ends. "We'll present everything at the next board meeting," John decided, "and this time, Vincent won't be able to escape." Daniel nodded, aware of the stakes involved. "It will be a masterstroke, but we need irrefutable evidence. I'm on it." John decided to share the situation with Emily. He knew that transparency was the only way to strengthen their relationship after everything they had been through. "Vincent isn't done with us," John told Emily, as they sat in the living room of their home. Emily felt a shiver, but this time she didn't let fear paralyze her. "We'll face it together. We didn't come this far to give up now." John looked at her, feeling that no matter what happened, Emily was now his anchor. He caressed her belly, feeling the connection with the baby who would soon be born. The battle was still not over, but they wouldn't be alone. The day of the board meeting arrived, and the tension in the room was palpable. Vincent entered confidently, unaware that John and Daniel had all the necessary information to expose his crimes. John stood up, carrying a file of incriminating evidence. "Vincent Marshall has manipulated the company's funds and hidden illegal transactions for years. Here is all the evidence." The board members, shocked and furious, began reviewing the documents. Vincent tried to defend himself, but the truth had already come to light. His control over the company crumbled within minutes. "Vincent, you have no place here." John's voice was firm. "This is the end of your game." Vincent, defeated and cornered, left the room under the cold gaze of his former allies. The board voted to expel him immediately and transferred total control back to John. With Vincent out of the way, John felt for the first time in a long while that the weight of pressure had lifted. He had regained his company, but more importantly, he had found something even more valuable: the promise of a real family alongside Emily and the baby on the way. Back at home, John lay beside Emily, feeling peace for the first time in months. "We've won," he whispered. Emily smiled, knowing that was just the beginning of a new life. "And we'll do it together, no matter what." Just when everything seemed resolved, Emily felt her first contraction. The baby was about to arrive. "John, I think it's time," she said, her eyes shining with excitement and nervousness. John felt his heart race. Life was about to take an unexpected turn, but this time he was ready. Emily felt another stronger contraction, and she knew the moment had come. John, usually unflappable in high-pressure situations, felt his heart race. He grabbed the prepared bag and helped Emily into the car, his nervousness barely concealed. "Breathe, Em. We're going to make it," he said, trying to stay calm as he drove toward the hospital. Despite the pain, Emily felt a sense of peace. Everything they had gone through had been worth it to reach this moment. She knew that regardless of the challenges of the past, this baby would be the beginning of something beautiful. The hours in the hospital passed slowly. John stayed by Emily's side, holding her hand and not leaving her alone for a moment. For the first time in a long time, his priority wasn't the company or family rivalries, but being present for the arrival of their child. "I'm here, Emily. I'm not going anywhere," he whispered, as she tried to endure each contraction. After hours of waiting and effort, the cry of a newborn filled the room. They looked at each other, exhausted, but overwhelmed with emotion. The doctor handed them the baby, and John felt his heart swell as he held his child for the first time. "He's perfect," Emily murmured, tears in her eyes. John looked at her, and then at the baby, feeling that finally his life had found the purpose he had long sought. As they held the baby, John looked at Emily, knowing that this moment required something special. "What name should we give him?" Emily smiled, knowing exactly what the answer would be. "William. It's the name your mother always wanted, right?" John felt a lump form in his throat. The idea of honoring his mother's memory and leaving behind the legacy of pain resonated deeply within him. "William Callahan," he repeated with a genuine smile. The name not only represented a new generation, but also a future filled with hope. While Emily rested with the baby in her arms, John stepped away for a moment to reflect. From the hospital window, he looked out at the city that had been the backdrop for so many conflicts, but also for his personal growth. In his mind, he went through the mistakes he had made, the betrayals he had faced, and the battles he had won. But now, all of that felt distant. For the first time, he didn't feel defined by his success or his last name, but by the love he had found in Emily and in their child. John took a deep breath, feeling that he was finally at peace. Back home, John and Emily lay together on the sofa, with little William sleeping in their arms. The house, which had once felt cold and empty, was now filled with life and warmth. "This is all I need," John said quietly, looking at his family. Emily rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the same. She knew their journey hadn't been easy, but they had made it here together, and that was all that mattered. As the house remained calm, John's phone vibrated with a message from Daniel. "All is set for the next phase. The company is completely yours." John turned off his phone, smiling. The future was in his hands, and for the first time, he felt he would build it from love and not from ambition. In the end, this story shows us that life is unpredictable, and that although paths may be filled with mistakes, betrayals, and challenges, there is always a chance for redemption. John and Emily learned that true success doesn't lie in power or wealth, but in love, honesty, and the ability to build a future together. No matter how difficult the past, we can always find peace by looking ahead and choosing what truly matters: family, loyalty, and commitment to those we love. Because in the end, the most important legacy we can leave is not in the businesses we build, but in the hearts we touch. This is the beginning of a new life for John, Emily, and their child, a reminder that there is always room for forgiveness, love, and a fresh start, no matter how complicated the journey has been. And that brings us to the end of our story today. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give us a like, subscribe, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming videos. Let us know in the comments what you thought and what lesson you take away. We'll see you in the next video. Take care, and remember, there's always a new opportunity to start over.